Hey guys, welcome back to BellaVet, and today we're going to be chatting all about vet school interviews. And so if you're new here, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the little bell notification icon so that you're always notified when I upload a video. And without further ado, let's get started. So I know that a big part of interviews is your attire, and for some of us, how we do our hair and our makeup, and that's kind of a big topic to do. And so I want to do that in a separate video. So if you're here for that, definitely stay tuned. It'll be coming out soon. But if you need a quick tip just to get you through in the meantime, I would say one of the biggest things is, while you should always feel comfortable and allowed to express yourself through your clothes and your hair and what you wear, I would say on interview day, you want the most striking thing about you to be your words and your brain and, how you speak and how you answer questions on interview day. And so I would say everything else should be polished and put together, but it should be understated in a way so that the most memorable thing about you is what you said that day. And so that is just a quick tip to get you guys through in the meantime. Okay, so my cycle, I applied to 7 schools and I got interviews at 2 of them. And not all of the schools actually did interviews, but of the ones that did, I got 2, and then at the end of the day, I was accepted to both of those schools and a third one that didn't require an interview process. And like I said, not everybody does interviews, but I really appreciate when they do because I feel like it gives you a sense of who some of the professors are. It also gives them a really good sense of who you are. And to me, it also tells me that this school really sees the importance of interpersonal skills in veterinary medicine. And both of the interviews I had were relatively short conversational interviews, so about like 15 to 30 minutes each. And some schools like to do longer format interviews. I knew of a friend who had an interview that was a couple hours long, and other schools do something called the MMI interview, which stands for multiple mini interviews. And to my knowledge, it's kind of like a station thing, and you move through these stations. But I didn't personally go through either of those types, so I can't really comment on that. So what I'll be chatting you guys through is what my interviews were like. Okay, so my first tip is to either call the school or look online and see if you can find out if this interview will be an open book interview or a closed book interview. So a open book interview means that they've looked at your resume and your application and your personal statements, and they might reference them in the interview. And a closed book interview means that they have not seen any of those things, and sometimes they may not know your name or they may not know anything about you walking into the interview. And so those are just kind of good things to know, at the start. And if it is an open book interview, then I would say as part of your interview prep, like maybe the night before, just look over your application and all of your reference materials one last time so that you refresh any of the little details that you sent in. So my second tip is to have a short, like 1 to 3 minute bio about yourself on hand, because a lot of these interviews start out with, hey, tell us a little bit about yourself, or hey, why do you want to be a veterinarian? And the answers to these questions, while we all could probably go on for hours about ourselves or why we're interested in veterinary medicine, these don't have to be long-winded. They can be fairly short, and they also don't have to be perfectly memorized. I would just think of a few bullet points to go over in your head and try to keep those memorized, and then practice with like a friend or a family member and get some feedback. And this answer will look really different depending on people's different paths. And so, for example, my bullet points would be something like, like where I grew up, if it was a rural town, if it was an urban town, and then my first true interest in veterinary medicine. And for me, that was when my aunt, who was a vet tech at the time, gave me a tour of our local vet clinic. And then it would be something like how that interest grew and progressed throughout high school. I took some anatomy classes and I was always really into science. And maybe I'll throw in a little bit of like what I like to do for fun. Like I love to teach dance and throw pottery on the wheel, and where you are now. So at the time I was a junior in college, and maybe mention like how those interests have continued, like what clubs you're a part of or what your favorite classes are and things like that. My third tip, and especially when you're prepping for your interview, is to have at least 2 examples of a time that you had to show resilience and persevere over some sort of obstacle, a time when you had a really big stressor in your life and how you dealt with and eventually overcame that stress. And my third one would be definitely have 2 examples of a time where you showed leadership characteristics, because that was one that I was asked about. I was asked about something like, oh, tell us about like, you know, how you've been a leader in college. And I said, oh, well, you know, I teach dance, and so I've been able to lead these, you know, little girls into being young women, and, you know, dance teaches a lot of discipline. And it was, you know, I gave that spiel, which I kind of had in my head a little bit. And then they said, okay, great. So what qualities do you think are required for leadership? And I didn't expect them to like circle back on leadership. I thought we were gonna move on. And so I was like, oh shoot, I already said the thing that I prepared about leadership, and now I have to think of something on the spot. And I kind of rambled a little bit at first, and then eventually there was one of my veterinary mentors, her voice like popped into my brain. And I remember we had a conversation one time about how vet techs are incredible and how you need to treat them really well, because at the end of the day they may be the ones saving your butt or allowing you to get some extra sleep or something like that. And so I told them, you know, I think you also need to lead with compassion and from a place of understanding the other roles in a veterinary hospital or clinic, because, you know, at the end of the day, these vet techs are going to be the ones helping you do your job as best as you can. And so you have to be really kind to them and lead with compassion. And so at that point, one of my interviewers stopped the interview, and he was just like, he looked me dead in the eye and he was like, exactly. I tell every first year vet student class that if you have a problem with the vet techs, I've got a problem with you. And at that moment I was like, nailed it. So I would say have, you know, kind of bullet point examples of these things in your head, but also like it does go to show like it's okay to come up with things, you know, on the spot, and sometimes those end up being your best answers. So my 4th tip are the actual questions I was asked. And sorry if you guys can hear the rain on my windows, it's raining really hard right now, but we're gonna move on, and I'm going to tell you guys all about the questions that I was asked. And keep in mind that the questions that I chose are questions that I was asked at both of my interviews. So they're the type of questions that you guys are most likely going to run into, but they are not questions that are specific or proprietary to the schools that I interviewed at. So I hope that makes sense. One of the questions that I would highly suggest you guys look up and form your own opinion on is what is the difference between animal rights and animal welfare? This question I was asked at both of my interviews, and I think it is a really important question. I won't get into the details of my answer of it because it's my personal opinion, and that could honestly be a whole separate video. But it is something that I think you guys going into this profession should have an opinion on, and it is a fair game question to ask in these interviews, because I think it tells the interviewer and the school a lot about your thoughts on the human-animal bond, and that is so important. So another classic is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? And this, while being a very basic question, you know, is pretty tough to answer sometimes because we don't always have all of those answers. But it is a good one to just chat through with your best friend or a family member and kind of get a sense of what your answer even is, because I think it is really easy as a high school student or a college student to get so focused on the next step. You know, oh, I just have to get into this college that has a pre-vet program, or I just have to do well on my orgo class, or I just have to do well on my physics class, or whatever it is. And it's so easy to focus so hard on the next step and get, you know, tunnel vision about it. And so I think this question is really important because it gives you a chance to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. So the next question that I got asked at both my interviews was, what was your favorite class and your least favorite class, and why? Because I answered my favorite and my least favorite at one of my interviews, and I had just totally blanked on saying like why they were that way. And then one of the lovely interviewers was like, so why is that? And I was like, oh my gosh, thank you for not letting me move on. And actually, yeah, I was just a little frazzled for that question. But my answer was, I had this class, it was my sophomore level biology class at Michigan State, where I did my undergrad, and basically they tried to do like a new way of teaching biology, and it involved flipping the classroom, and it also involved like completely scrapping the old syllabus and the way the class was run, and just gut everything and change everything, which had its pros. I really loved the lab portion of it. We got to do PCR and gel electrophoresis, I think is how I pronounce it. And that was such a cool project, and we got to replicate the Huntington's disease gene, and it was just a really awesome project where I felt like I was doing science like from this century, which was nice. I learned so much, and it was great. But the classroom portion of the exam was just fraught with so much confusion, and just our grading system was like, everybody would be on the same page, including the TAs. Like the students and the TAs would be like, okay, this is how much this is weighted, and this is what goes into our grade, blah, blah, blah. I think I should get this grade. And then we would get a grade back that was completely different than that. And then we'd be like, wait, why is it like that? And our professor would be like, oh, the rules that you interpreted this way are actually interpreted this way. And it was just so confusing. And it made me really appreciate, you know, that while being a great scientist sometimes, you know, it might not translate to being a great teacher, to being a great manager of people, really. And so that was kind of what I remember from my answer of it. But yeah, it is an important question because, you know, you're going to be in really, really intensive classes for the next 4 years, and some you're going to love and some you're going to hate, and some will be really, really well run and super straightforward and not necessarily easy, but just not confusing. And then you'll have other classes which are not like that and will be confusing and not straightforward and really frustrating. And I guess knowing that you've experienced that before and knowing that you've come up with ways to navigate it is really important. And I think it's okay to say, hey, I've had some not so great experiences, but this is what I've learned. And now going forward, if I have a similar experience to that, now I know that this is how I should talk to professors, or this is when I should bring up the issues that I'm having, or whatever it is, because they're kind of inevitable. Next question is hobbies. I got asked at both of my interviews, like, what do you like to do for fun? And it might seem like a really frivolous question, but you know, the next 4 years of your life are going to be extremely overwhelming and stressful sometimes, and sometimes they'll be really amazing. But you know, in order to combat that stress and to keep your mental health intact during those stressful times, you know, you need to understand how your body best deals with stress. And if that means chilling and watching Netflix and just zoning out, that's one way to deal with it. You know, if that means going out with your friends and spending really quality time with people you love, then that's great. For me, I really loved, sometimes I was in the mood to Netflix binge, but sometimes I was like, I need to make something and I need to be productive, but not in a way that is stressful like school. I need to be productive. Like, I love doing pottery, so I want to make something, and it's where I can kind of shut off my brain and just use my hands. And so that was kind of one of my answers for it. So my next question is kind of a juicy one, and basically I wasn't asked like straight up, hey, how are you gonna pay for vet school? Because it's not exactly the best way to ask that question. It's not the most polite thing to do. But I was asked, hey, have you looked at the different options available to you for financing your education? Which is a very similar question, worded a little differently. And, I think it is something that you'll be taking out a lot of loans, and it's something that's important to be educated on before you go to vet school, because I think there are some students in the past that weren't really well educated on it until halfway through vet school, and then they realized what they had gotten themselves into, and they don't want their students to have regret, which is understandable, but it is also, a very touchy subject to talk about. And so, but yeah, that's basically how they asked it to me was, have you looked into the options of how to finance your education? And I said, yes, I have. And actually the week beforehand, my mom, who is an accountant, walked me through a loan simulator, and I learned a lot of things. And this is what I told them. And I said, I have some savings right now, and they were something that, I would love to study abroad at some point in vet school. And I thought, because that's an optional thing for me to do, like I should save my savings and spend it then. And my mom said, well, you have interest on your loans, so it might be a better idea to spend it now when you start vet school and try to decrease the amount that you borrow, or try to pay some of that interest off at the very beginning so that it doesn't accrue to as big of a number by the end. And she gave me an option of like, okay, let's say you used it to pay down part of your education later in your vet school career versus right at the beginning. And she's like, your money would get you further if you did it at the beginning. And I was just, my mind was just blown with that, because it was something that I considered like, oh, this is what I am doing for fun, so I should use my savings for it and not use loan money for that. That felt bad, even though it was still paying for school, it was still school. And so, yeah, it was just counterintuitive at the beginning, but by the end of it, once we had crunched the numbers, it was really eye-opening that, that little amount could make such a big difference. And so I kind of explained it to them a little less rambly. And they were really impressed with that, and they even joked and said, hey, can your mom come talk to our VBMA club, which is the Veterinary Business Management Association? And I was just like, yeah, she'd love to. And so we had a nice chuckle about that. But it is something that would be really great for you guys to look up before your interview and play with a loan simulator. And a really great resource for that is something called VIN, or the Veterinary Information Network. And their charitable branch, it's called the VIN Foundation. And if you go to, I believe it's vetschoolbound.com, or if you just Google VIN Foundation cost of education or VIN Foundation debt simulator, you'll find a bunch of really amazing resources that allow you to get a really good estimate of what your education is going to cost, and then plug that into a loan simulator, and you can see, hey, if I use this program, what would my monthly bill be versus if I use the 10-year plan versus the 25-year plan versus, all of the different options. So it's a really good resource, and I'll link it down below. So tip number 5 is to breathe, and just take a minute right before your interview and take a deep breath in and then let it all out. And this is something actually that the woman who escorted me into one of my interviews had me do right outside the door to kind of calm my nerves, and it really helped, and it was really great. And along with that, I always like to tell people who ask me tips for interviews is, your interviewers are secretly on your side. They are secretly rooting for you to succeed. And that might sound kind of funny, but if you look at it from their perspective, think about it. Like, what would they want? Would they want the interview to go really boring and awkward and dull or bad? Or would they want the interview to go super well and be fascinating and be totally blown away by you? you know, they would want the second one. That's more fun for the interviewer. And at the end of the day, it makes their job easier because they're like, oh yeah, slam dunk, like she's definitely getting, you know, a spot in our class. It makes their job easier. It makes their job more fun if things go well. And so you're walking into the room hoping that you can do a good job and that it goes well for you and that this is the right school for you and that they let you in. But on the other side of the table, you're walking in the door and they're hoping it goes well and that you're a really amazing applicant and that you're a good fit for their school. So at the end of the day, both parties want this to go well. So at the end of the day, they really are rooting for you even if they can't come right out and say it. Okay, and tip number 6 is after your interview is over, I know it's really hard, but try your best to just stop thinking about it, or at the very least, try not to criticize yourself about it afterwards, because it's said and done. You can't change it. You can't change what happened or what you said. And think about it, you know, during your interview, you have like 15 to 30 minutes to think of your answers and to have that conversation, versus after your interview, you have an unlimited amount of time to think about the questions that you were asked. And now you can think of, you know, all of the most brilliant answers that your brain can come up with, given 2 hours to think of an answer that you need to come up with in 30 seconds. And that is just something that is bound to happen. You know, you will come up with better answers given more time. And that, you know, is something that your interviewers, they know that the interview is short. They know that you only had a little bit of time to come up with your answers to each question. And so at the end of the day, like, they're also not expecting you to come up with the most brilliant answers of all time. You know, they didn't give you the questions beforehand so that you could come up with the most perfect, you know, beautifully edited answers. That's not how it worked. And they know that you were put on the spot and had to come up with things on the fly, and they take all of that into consideration. And at the end of the day, after your interview, you know, what you said is okay, and it probably sounds a lot better in the moment, you know, to your interviewers than it does in your head, you know, criticizing it after the fact. Like, you were probably way more impressive than you thought you were. So just try to believe that and try your best not to criticize yourself afterwards, and wait for your answer, and hopefully you guys all get in. I am over here rooting for you and being your cheerleader, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to message me either here or some of the best ways to get in contact with me is through Instagram. And yeah, I cannot wait to hear about the places you guys get interviews, and I can't wait to hear about all of your acceptances. And yeah, so be sure to keep me updated on your lives, and I can't wait to hear more. And that's all I have for you guys today. So if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the little bell notification icon, and I'll see you next time.